Dr. Shin, Ambassador Shin, also was in the Foreign Service, Ambassador to Ethiopia. We have Mr. Nia Kwete, a former Georgetown University professor. All of their bios are with you. I won't go into detail. And then we have Mr. Adesun, who is the fund manager for Koroma Capital out of New York. And then we have a well-known author and publisher, Dr. Sharon Freeman. So we're going to go right to the panel, and I'll start with Ambassador Shin. Dr. Shin, thank you.
Thank you very much, Robin. I'm going to try to condense my remarks for the sake of time as we're running quite late. I want to start by pointing out the four interests that I believe China has in Africa. First, China wants to ensure access to oil, minerals, and raw materials that account for more than 85% of its imports from Africa and contribute significantly to its GDP growth rate. Second, China desires good relations with all African countries so that it can seek their political and economic support in regional and international forums such as the UN Commission on Human Rights and the World Trade Organization. Third, it seeks to end Taiwan's diplomatic presence in Africa and replace it with that of Beijing. And fourth, China wants to increase significantly its exports to Africa as African economies grow and Africans become wealthier. Now let's look at American interests in Africa. This is my own version. Don Yamamoto might disagree with me. The United States has five major interests in Africa. First, it depends on Africa for about 20% of its imported oil. Second, the United States seeks the support of African countries in regional and international forums. Third, it needs the consent of African countries for military aircraft overflight and landing rights and access by its naval vessels to African ports. And fourth, the United States seeks to expand its exports to Africa. Fifth, Africa, like other parts of the world, confronts a number of negative developments such as terrorism, piracy, money laundering, and drug trafficking. The United States seeks to minimize these threats so that they do not harm U.S. interests in Africa or manifest themselves in the United States. Chinese and American interests in Africa are surprisingly similar. The United States and China share three interests in Africa. The only Chinese interest that does not apply to the United States is China's goal to replace Taiwan's diplomatic representation in Africa. Similar Chinese and American interests in Africa suggest the likelihood of greater competition between the two countries. While this may be the case over the longer term, it has not led to serious competition so far. Both the United States and China tend to support political stability and the status quo in Africa. With some exceptions, such as Chinese support for authoritarian governments in Sudan and Zimbabwe, this actually offers an area for potential collaboration. For example, the United States and China have worked together to support the transitional federal government in Somalia. Early in the Obama administration, the African Bureau of the State Department requested its embassies in Africa to increase reporting and analysis on Chinese activity in Africa. All you've got to do is read WikiLeaks. There seemed to be an initial bias for identifying areas where both countries could cooperate. The United States welcomed continued Chinese contributions to UN peacekeeping operations in Africa and the anti-piracy operation in the Gulf of Aden. In Liberia, the United States and China joined forces to eradicate malaria and supported UN peacekeeping projects, including construction of the barracks at Bonga. But there were very few other cases of Chinese-American collaboration on the continent. There was one in Ethiopia that Don Yamamoto is quite familiar with, but you can count them on one hand. China's preference is to operate bilaterally so that it does not have to accommodate U.S. concerns about transparency, human rights, and democratization. China has shown consistently, that it has little interest in joining donor coordination groups in African capitals. These informal groups are controlled by Western donor countries. To the extent that China engages on a multilateral basis, it prefers to do so in the context of the United Nations and more recently even the World Bank, where it has greater ability to influence the ground rules. Some African governments have made clear that they would not benefit from Chinese cooperation with the West on economic assistance. These governments prefer to negotiate individually with donor countries so that they have greater leverage and more options. This is especially true in the case of interaction with China, which does not impose political conditions on its aid, although most of its assistance is in the form of loans that are tied to Chinese companies. A number of African countries fear that the United States and other Western donors will use cooperation with China to attach political conditions to its development assistance. Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs Johnny Carson met with representatives of Western oil companies in Lagos in February 2010 in response to a question from one of the participants on the relative influence of China and the United States in Africa. Carson responded that the United States does not consider China a military, security, or intelligence threat. China is very aggressive and pernicious economic competitor with no morals. China is not in Africa for altruistic reasons. China is in Africa primarily for China. A secondary reason for China's presence is to secure votes in the United Nations from African countries. And a third reason is to prove that Taiwan is not an issue. Carson added that there are tripwires for the United States when it comes to China. Is China developing a blue water navy? Have they signed military base agreements? Are they training armies? Have they developed intelligence operations? Once these areas start developing, then the United States will start worrying. The United States will continue to push democracy and capitalism while Chinese authorities while Chinese authoritarian capitalism is politically challenging. I'm just setting Don up here for his remarks, making it easy for him. The United States does not view China as a threat in Africa. I think that's very apparent in terms of what Johnny Carson has said and in terms of what other observers have concluded in looking at this relationship. Like China, the United States is primarily in Africa for its own interests. Let's be very sincere about this. Looking to the future, Carson's comments on tripwires underscore that certain Chinese actions in Africa will result in a reassessment of Washington's approach to Chinese relations with Africa. There's a growing understanding in the Obama administration that the United States cannot sit back and complain about China's success in Africa. It must become more active and competitive. Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs William Fitzgerald addressed the Chinese challenge during a roundtable discussion with journalists in South Africa in October 2010. While he did complain that Chinese investment in infrastructure projects in Africa do not include sufficient technology transfer to Africans, bring in too much Chinese labor, and often undercut African construction companies, he acknowledged that there is a positive side to China's engagement. He commented that the Chinese are cash-rich and investment-hungry, which requires that the United States become more competitive. If China forces American companies to pay more attention to Africa and to improve their competitiveness, this could work to the benefit of both the United States and Africa. The U.S. Export-Import Bank is one tool whereby Washington is trying to become more engaged in Africa. In 2009, the bank invested about $800 million in 41 sub-Saharan African countries. The chairman of the bank, Fred Hochberg, during a visit to South Africa late in 2010, hinted that U.S. investors may be forced to match China's favorable investment terms for African governments. It has become increasingly apparent that in order to compete with China in Africa, the United States will have to devise a new strategy without compromising its core foreign policy principles, especially the promotion of democracy and support for human rights. American and Chinese differences over the process of democratization and human rights promise to be a major hurdle in efforts by the two countries to collaborate on projects in Africa. The United States puts a premium on individual human rights, freedom of speech, movement, and assembly. China has a very different approach to human rights that emphasizes collective and community rights and the right to escape poverty. Individual rights are not especially important to the Chinese. These two concepts are fundamentally different. Many African countries seem to be torn between the different approaches, while a few ignore both Western and Chinese concept of human rights. Just to conclude, so long as the Chinese leadership emphasizes national sovereignty and professes to eschew non-interference in the internal affairs of African countries, China will pursue a very different approach to governance in Africa than that urged by the United States. During the Obama administration, this may prove to be the single most important philosophical obstacle to American and Chinese cooperation in Africa. African governments that perceive an advantage in Chinese and Western competition in Africa will also have a major impact on the way China and the United States interpret and interact with each other on the continent. Nevertheless, there will continue to be areas related to African political stability and UN peacekeeping where the United States and China will find common ground. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Shin. We'll go right to our next panelist. We're going to keep everyone's presentation at 8 minutes to try to be as close to getting back on time as possible.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Sanders. I very much appreciate the opportunity to be here. My 80% of what I want to say, actually, I am directing it at Africa, at my fellow Africans, because as a number of people have said, you know, we've heard about U.S. interests, we've heard about Chinese interests, but it seems to me it's about time that Africa's interests were highlighted, but no one is going to do it except for the Africans do it themselves, except we Africans do it ourselves. So what I'm putting out is a way that we can engage the debate, so that the debate about China in Africa is not just a debate between Washington and Beijing. I think really the debate ought to be intense in Africa. Now, of course, the debate has started already, and I have noticed two schools of thought. One is what I might call the anxious Western establishment, who are saying, oh my goodness, look at China in Africa. We used to be there. What are they doing? They are making friends with unsavory regimes. And because our time is short, I'll jump around. I would like to remind such people that the number of dictatorships supported by the West far outweigh the ones that are being supported by the Chinese. I will mention Mobutu in Congo. I'll mention the Chad strongman who's now Hissène Habré. So when I listen to the debates, it seems to me there are exaggerations on both sides. That's one school of thought. The second school of thought, which I also disagree with, but is largely by what I call irritated African opinion leaders. Their attitude is, why is the West telling us not to be friendly with the Chinese? Why are they warning us about the Chinese? After all, they've done worse to us over all these hundreds of years than the Chinese. And my attitude is the underlining logic bothers me. It says because we have had a bad relationship with the West for 500 years, anybody who's not the West must be good. No, I say we have to develop a system of saying that, fine, anybody who comes into Africa to engage with us, we have to have a system of protecting our interests. So I want to talk a little bit about what I think that system should be. A number of people have mentioned, even when they've considered that Africans have to take care of their interests, have looked to governments. Governments are fine, but the future of Africa, even just in economic development, is too important to leave to just governments. I think that the missing piece is the public as a general concept, and then civil society. And in civil society, I'm emphasizing one particular group, the media. You can see reports in African media about what the Chinese are doing on the ground. We've had instances reported of shoddy goods coming into Africa. We've had instances of employees of Chinese businesses being mistreated. I think the African media needs to do more of that. Now, if you look at the general public as consumers of Chinese goods, they have to push back against shoddy goods. But I think the large portion of what Africa needs to do in order to protect its interests when it deals with the Chinese has to be done by what I call the expanded civil society. And here, the emphasis is on universities, the emphasis is on research institutes. They have to do deep, detailed analysis and research of what the Chinese engagement is for Africa, its impact. Now, thus far, we are talking about trade and investment. But I think that some people looking at China, especially with the rise of only 30 years ago, and the economy has said to become number 2 in the world, are thinking that perhaps beyond trade and investment, Africa ought to copy the Chinese model. So I think we do need to do research into that as well. Is that the best model for Africa? And I think if you are looking at development models, then you move from just economics to government, to governance. And a number of people have hinted at this, but I think it's not being emphasized enough. For good development in Africa, democracy is important, and China is not a democracy by most definitions I've seen. Where I come from, young people are told if you're going to marry someone, visit their home and see how they treat the old people. If you see how they handle their home, you can see your future. For Africa to select its proper development model, we have to look at what China does in its own country. And so I think it should not be made too narrow a debate. Africans need to look at who is coming into Africa. We need to have a systematic way of reviewing what it is they are doing in their own countries. And granted that Western engagement with Africa is full of things that one regrets, we have to deal with the West as it is today. And I think if we look at that carefully, in my opinion, but I'm just one African, the billions of Africans have to decide collectively. But in my opinion, if you look at the West, with its evolving democracy, with its core systems, with its human rights, it is, to me, a better model for Africa than the Chinese model, and not the least of the advantages that I think the West enjoys over China as a comparative model is the presence of Africans. I mean, people like me, I call us the second wave diaspora, but there is the first wave diaspora here. So you have got, the West has got comparative advantages, in my opinion. So my final point, as actually I said 80% of what I'm saying is meant for Africans, 20% is meant for the United States. I don't think that the U.S. should give up on Africa and say, okay, the Chinese have it. I think actually the U.S. has a much better competitive advantage. And thus far, African governments will like the quick deals they can do with China. But if you check with the African peoples, you will see that they will far prefer the slower democratic model of the West. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Atukwe. Thank you very much. Mr. Adesun, please, 8 minutes.
Tough task.
Yes.
Well, let me at least start off by saying thank you to Ambassador Sanders for inviting me. I feel like I am amongst a group of people here where I really do not belong, right? Because my focus is all about returns and making money. But in that pursuit, though, as a global investor, it's led me all over the world looking for what we call risk-adjusted returns. The world I live in, which is investments, really, we all agree that returns are generally going to be low everywhere you go. So to get returns, we look for three things. We're looking for growth. We're looking for situations or countries or continents with great demographics and meaning great consumer demand. Great consumer demand, and then we're looking for we're looking for areas where infrastructure is good and the environment is really conducive for growth. So here, I think, real quickly, this is my agenda. I'll move over here into this next topic, just talking about growth. I believe China and Africa has three similarities: growth, demographics, and a huge and fast rising consumer. So if you look at this slide, which is from McKinsey, frankly, it talks about the top growth areas in the world: emerging Asia, Middle East, and Africa is the third country. To me, that's a huge area of similarity. The next area is urbanization, and this is an example of what's happening on the continent of Africa compared to China as well. Here's the population, and you could see developed countries versus developing countries, and I think China and Africa fall into the same category in this area. Now, one of the things I think that's been really missing during this conversation so far is highlighting what has changed in Africa this time around, why we have this kind of growth, right? Because this is one of the reasons why there's growth in Africa, and I don't think we can deny it, is the rising price of commodities, right? And that stems from demand from the BRICS, right? Brazil, Russia, India, and China. And so that demand from China has really helped commodity prices grow higher, and it's helped a lot of African countries. And it's helped a lot of African countries develop. Why now and why not in the past when we had instances of rising commodity prices? I think what's missing this time is the transition in Africa of governments moving into more democratic forms of government and more political stability, fewer areas of conflict, and what Dr. Okonjo-Iweala mentioned earlier, which is professionals and a reverse brain drain helping to improve African economies, so that this time around, with the rise in price in commodities, they could actually capture those gains and make sure the governments the economies were improving. So I think that's a huge issue that has not been recognized. And I think what people worry about in terms of what China coming into Africa this time around is you have professionals that are still back in this reverse brain drain. They understand development in the West very well. And I believe very strongly that even regardless of some of the initial challenges these countries have faced in negotiating trade with China, I think it will get better, and I think they will make sure they emphasize that China helps in terms of local jobs, skilled workers, and actually having manufacturing on the ground going forward. Here's a quick map of obviously China's investment base on the continent, and obviously you can see if you go further today, one of the professors showed a map that would even show more penetration on the continent. Growth, somebody has already showed this growth as well. And here are the issues, right? So this abundant natural resources is a major issue, and this is why people believe China is all over Africa. And I think this will continue. The question then becomes for African governments and Africans to make sure that this plays a role in the development and continues to grow as well. So my focus is, and this is the other issue. So this is the other issue, which is also land and agricultural production. And I think this is all tied to food security all over. And this will also continue as China develops and it tries to feed its people with high quality food going forward, and even local conditions as well. Here's some of the issues that people have talked about, which is what happened where we're getting all this press about China. Talked about the 48 presidents going to Beijing, what China is doing in Zambia, etc., infrastructure. And this continues. Then there's this issue of these trade zones that China is building all over Africa and encouraging. And I think China has over 100 of these trade zones in China right now. The trade zones help you focus really in developing infrastructure and developing a really good consumer base. And it's worked in China, and I think it's being practiced in Africa, and I think it should be encouraged going forward as well. Obviously, here are the negatives, and I think a lot of people have talked about the negatives, and I don't want to harbor on them. Here's what I think going forward. I think African governments are driving harder bargains with China. You've seen the case in Angola. You've seen the case in the Congo. And I think that will continue. And I think with the reverse brain drain of professionals going back, they understand exactly what good business practices are. That will continue. My focus is mostly with the private sector, and what we look for in investing in China is the same thing we look for in investing in Africa. So, for example, I mean, my bio talks about the fact that in the past I invested close to 10% of my endowment in China. What we looked for when we moved to China was we were looking for really smart people, educated here mostly, so they know and then worked here, and still had a local connection back in China, and they moved back. And that's the same thing you're finding in Africa, and you're finding it extensively now, which is very encouraging in Africa as well. So, I mean, for my conclusion, I think the capital flow to Africa for investments is a very good positive for Africa from China, and I think it's going to continue. I think improving infrastructure is a great thing, and I think increasing employment is good as China's manufacturing helps create jobs. Obviously, they have to train workers to improve the skilled labor force, and then continued demand for resources, I think, is a good thing for Africa. Those are my remarks.
Thank you. And our last panelist, thank you so much, Mr. Adesun, is Dr. Sharon Freeman. And I think as many of you know, Dr. Freeman is a prolific writer, and her latest book is actually focused on China, and it's China, Africa, and the perspectives from the diaspora. Dr. Freeman.
Thank you. Well, I have the pleasure of being your last speaker. So 2 things. I better be fast and I better be good. I can assure you I'll be fast. Okay. All right. I am very pleased to have been invited here today because I really feel like I am a stakeholder. I lived in China for 12 years and I worked in over 40 African countries, and so I really care about this issue, which is why I embarked upon a 2-year effort to write this book, which is called China, Africa, and the African Diaspora Perspective. So what I'll speak to today is perspectives drawn from this book, which includes the voices of a number of esteemed colleagues in this room today, like Ambassador Shin, Mel Foote, and others. So the book contains 60 essays, and the perspectives are broad and wide about all aspects of China's engagement in Africa. But before I get into that, I just want to tell you, I just returned from China 3 days ago and Hong Kong. And one of the reasons why I went to Hong Kong, and this is an issue I didn't hear anybody mention with regard to how China does things. It does things really fast. I met someone from the Legislative Council of Hong Kong just in a public forum, and I said, you know what, I think a lot of black people are interested in doing business in China. And he went back, and within 4 hours, he told this university to invite me as the keynote speaker at the launching of an advanced Institute for Cross-Disciplinary Studies. Never saw the man before, never heard from him again. He said, make it happen, and it happened. And the reason why I lived in Hong Kong so long is because I met somebody, and he had been there for many, many years, and I said, why did you come to Hong Kong in 1950? And he said it's because it's the only place where you can have a business idea at 9 o'clock in the morning, incorporate it by 12 noon, and make your first profit by 5. And I said, that's where I need to go. So anyway, when I was in Hong Kong, one of the things I discussed was the relationship of China and Africa. And I tell you, to the person, everybody in Hong Kong is interested in that. They don't all know about the specifics. In fact, I went there to tell them about it, but they heard so much about it. And what they think about it is that it's a great success story, and they all want to be involved in that. And they said, tell us more. How's that going? And, we hear this and we hear this. So everybody's excited about it. But the book that I am referring to that I did earlier, I actually did studies in Africa and in China. And in China, I can tell you everybody is also very interested in China's engagement in Africa. And so one of the biggest lessons that I learned in all of that study was that China has a strategy, but more than just being a strategy, it's marching orders for every government at the head of the food chain, to the provincial level, to state-owned enterprises, to private enterprises. everybody knows exactly what that strategy is and how they fit into it. So it's not just a matter of having a strategy. Everybody knows about the strategy. Everybody's involved in the strategy. It's marching orders for every single institution in that country. You could go to any institution you can think of, and they'll tell you exactly what the China-Africa strategy is. So it's very important. The other thing I think is one of the biggest takeaway lessons, and I really want to underscore this given the comments I heard earlier. China is, as a whole, is a great big learning institution. Just because it has a strategy, it does not mean that strategy is immutable. It's adaptable. Because China learns the best from the best. And that is what I can say to Africans. And I don't mean just African leaders, the African people, to all Africans, and including us, African Americans as well, and Africans in the diaspora. When China wants to know how you do something the best, they research that. They figure out who does that the best, and they don't care where they come from. They fly them in, and they pick their brains, and then they do something that was referred to earlier, which is that they adapted into the Chinese model with special Chinese characteristics. That is a term that you need to be familiar with, because that's what they do with regard to everything. They take it, they shake it up, they blend it, and they call it their own. And I will go back to another point. Another reason why I went to China recently was because I'm going to form a Confucius classroom. Perhaps some of you have heard of Confucius Institutes. I bet you none of you have heard of Confucius classrooms, but we could talk about that later. But anyway, China believes in the proliferation of knowledge about China's culture, about how they do business, and other regards. Have we ever heard of an Africa Institute in the same way? Is Africa proliferating knowledge about African culture in the same way? So we heard Dr. Ngozi talk about the fact that Africans need to have their strategy for their engagement with the Chinese. I absolutely agree with that, and I think that it has to be based on a lot of research and knowledge that is gleaned not just from one example, but from many examples. You know, one of the favorite comments that someone made in this book is D.L. McNeil. Sorry he couldn't be here today. He's a black gentleman who's a great China scholar. And he says, you know, learning is so important. He said, when Africans are looking for knowledge, when they look toward the East, they need to stop and pause their gaze even on the Middle East, because the Middle East did something with oil that is a great example. They said, this is a finite resource. If you want this, let me tell you what you're going to do for us. We want our engineers to know how to extract it. We want everybody in these countries to have, you know, free education. So there are lessons everywhere. And, you know, it's been, for me as a development economist, having worked in so many African countries for so many years, it's been one of my disappointments to find myself in a situation of, for instance, preparing the 93rd export strategy for Tanzania in 3 years. That means what happened to the other 92, you know, and why was all of that money going against their balance of payments for all of these consultants? Where is all this knowledge? Where's all the studies? I would tell you in China's case, they book that knowledge. They use it and they adapt their situation to it. So anyway, China, when you think about what a strategy is, okay, first thing is they had one, okay? But a strategy is basically the art and the science of putting all of the actors together in motion to execute the plan. So let's talk about the science of what China's strategy is. The science is that they engaged all of their institutions, financial, labor, state-owned enterprises, you name it, into what this plan is. Let's talk a little bit about what the art is, though. The art is the way they did things was slightly different, and feelings matter. Okay, at the top, and I'm going to call this a pyramid of relationships. At the top of the pyramid, the relationship of Chinese leaders to African leaders, bilateral though it may be, was one that I think was a very welcome approach by the African leaders. When people want to make fun of the fact that China called in all of the African leaders together and hauled them all over there and rolled out the strategy, it was a stroke of brilliance, I tell you. It's not a laughing matter. In this country, the most African leaders that have ever been invited at one time is 6, and that was under the Bush administration. We have never done that. So the way that things are done matters. And so, I can give you a lot of different examples of, the art that was applied to, the strategy. But I will say this. At the top of the pyramid, the relationship has been fantastic. Why? Because China followed the priorities of Africa. Not the other way around. They said, you want stadia? And everybody can laugh about that. They go and they build stadiums and whatever. The Africans wanted it. Okay, so they're doing what the Africans want, and the relationship at the top of the pyramid has been fantastic, but the topic of my talk is turning that pyramid upside down. Reason for that topic is that the small businesses, the women, and the people of Africa now are being disadvantaged compared to the marketing power and the ability to compete of Chinese competitors. Some of that competition is fair, some of it's not fair. But the point of the matter is that Western institutions for a long time have focused on, in their engagement with Africa, that the sequence of events should be that you realign policies, you build institutions, and then you get down to the firm level intervention, and somewhere along the road, down the line, you build the roads. China came in with a strategy and said it's time to build those roads. So while we were focused on the rules of the roads, they were focused on building the road. Now we're a part of that, but they're winning our bids from the Millennium Challenge Corporation and the World Bank and all of the rest of that. So they're actually building the infrastructure. So I think that, it's been very important for China to have a set of priorities and to follow that. But at the same time now, they are out competing, the local African business owners. And so in this book, I have mentioned and said it's for the Chinese to hear because they are very aware of everything. You really need to focus now, since you're viewing yourself as China Inc., since it's a win-win business deal, all of your engagements, then you need to have corporate social responsibility. And in that CSR, you need to focus on what you can do to help build capacity for African small businesses, productive businesses, and women-owned businesses. Because as soon as you sit down on the side of the road and you sell a better donut than a woman, you put that African woman out of business, and that's a problem. So this talk comes at a very interesting time, given what's happening in Tunisia and Egypt. Okay, and when we talk about turning the pyramid upside down, this is why we're talking about it, because if the people don't feel like they're getting all of the benefits that they need from this engagement, no matter how great it might be. We talked a lot about perceptions earlier in the day. Perceptions matter. So the leaders feel good at the top of the pyramid. At the base of the pyramid, you have a big problem. So anyway, I've told the Chinese you need to do this and that and that. And they called me, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs called me directly at my house from China. And they said, Dr. Freeman, what you're saying is absolutely right. But we're not going to do what you say. They said the African leaders have to engage us. We don't deal with individuals. We don't deal with NGOs. We deal with countries. So when the countries, tell us that these are their priorities, then this is what we would do. And we're not saying that what you're saying is wrong, but we're saying you're not our partner. They're our partner. So going back to the point of Dr. Ngozi's and the African Union, I think that it's really important for the African Union to try to play a constructive role in crafting the strategy of Africa as a whole. In the book that I'm mentioning, we do have the essays of the former president of Botswana, the current president of Senegal, and they were among the African leaders that went to China in 2006 when they all went. And I asked them, I said, now, you all went to China. Did you sort of huddle and figure out some kind of strategy as to what you were going to do when you got to China? Nope, nobody ever mentioned it. And to this day, I can't really find any evidence of really the significant role that, and I'm not saying I know everything and I know, but I don't see what's happening. So in conclusion, though, let me just say that the way forward, okay? So China has a strategy. The U.S. has a strategy. I'm going to focus this on the U.S. I've already talked about Africa. With regard to the U.S., we have our National Export Initiative, but we have 19 federal government agencies involved in trade. What I would like to see is a client approach, where every client would get a number. Your client number 100. You start with going down the line with all 19 federal government agencies, and so everybody can understand how to address and adapt these programs to the needs of a specific client. Because within all of these 19 federal government agencies, you have many, many different programs. And even in those individual agencies, take the Small Business Administration. If you get a loan or you get a guarantee or you have an 8A or you have a small business investment company, they're all on parallel tracks. Nobody understands. There is no system of a client number. And so the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing. And so to contrast that again to the China situation, that is not the case. Everybody has a role in the strategy, if you want to compare this to the National Export Initiative. Everybody has a role. There's no duplication. Everybody knows what it is, and they intersect. It's not on parallel tracks. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Freeman. In the interest of time, our keynote speaker is here for lunch already, Ambassador Yamamoto, and I will take two very, very short questions, not comments, but very, very short questions, and then you can also ask questions at the luncheon. Ambassador Yamamoto has to leave on time, and so we want to make sure that we get started on time for the luncheon. We're about 6 minutes over the time frame, but we'll take two short questions and succinct questions from the floor before we go to lunch. There's one in the back. Sorry. Can't see who that is, actually.
Thank you very much. I'm Rui Manuel, a master's student. I'm from Angola, master's student at Georgetown University. My question is with regards to the U.S. approach. I think we've heard during the entire day that the common theme is that the China approach is working in some places as glimpses of brilliance, as Dr. Freeman just alluded to. But there are also flaws in its strategy, and I think that's where the U.S. can play a role. Where do you think, from an investment and trade perspective, that the U.S. can take advantage of that and increase its presence and partnership with Africa?
Thank you. Dr. Freeman, would you take that, please?
Yeah, one thing I neglected to mention, which is the most important thing, I think, of all, is the role that the diaspora plays in development. If you look at why China grew so quickly, you'll see that it's largely because of remittances and investment from the Chinese overseas diaspora. So I would say in the case of Africa, that strategies that we have, I don't think are focusing enough on harnessing the knowledge and the resources of the diaspora to help Africa grow. And so I think that it should do that. And that also speaks to focusing on some of the diaspora knowledge and resources that are here in America, not just within regards singularly to investing in Africa, but also collectively joining hands with the Chinese to actually make investments in Africa, and for us to make investments in China too, because China is also a big market. So I would say strategies that tap into the diaspora are needed.
Thank you. One other question? Yes, sir. And that will be the last one, and the others we'll take in the luncheon room.
Thank you very much. My name is Fred Oladende. I'm with the Foundation for Democracy in Africa. And I'd like each of the speakers to please reconcile the need for China to create 200 million jobs every year to attain political stability at home, as against the high unemployment, 60 to 70% in Africa, that is causing the kind of chaos we're seeing in Tunisia, we're seeing in Egypt, and we also may see replicated in different parts of Africa. I think it would also be nice to hear from each of the speakers how we reconcile the issue of an authoritarian regime looking out to promote democracy, freedom, and women empowerment. I think these are very key issues, and I would like to have each of the speakers point on those. Thank you.
Well, we're going to allow one speaker to really address that, I think, in the interest of time, and then we'll try to follow it up in lunch. Dr. Shin.
Yes, you've raised really several questions there, and I'll just try to encapsulate one answer to the several different questions. Clearly, the China and the U.S. have a different approach to dealing with these kinds of issues, but the one thing we have in common is that we both are primarily interested in our own interests. And as a result, China is not particularly concerned at this point about high unemployment rates in Africa. And in all fairness, probably the United States is not either. This may come back to haunt China more than the United States because of the nature of its involvement in Africa now, and they may pay a greater price for this. We heard from Wenran, I think, earlier, in terms of the rate of the RMB. The local textile person in China said, "I'm concerned about Chinese unemployed. I'm not concerned about Africans being unemployed." And that strikes me as being probably fairly typical of the reaction that you will find in China. That is going to be their primary concern. It's the increasing the GDP growth rate, or keeping it at the rate of about 9% annually, where it's been for the last 3 decades, and not letting it fall much below that. Because if it does, then you start having internal unrest in China itself. And the Chinese are clearly more interested in preventing that than they are in preventing a future overthrow of Mubarak or an overthrow of the president of Tunisia. And this is going to be a dilemma for China, and I'm sure that the government of China is aware of it and concerned about it, but I don't think they have any good answers for it.
Thank you. Can you please join me in giving the panel a round of applause? Our panelists will stay for lunch, and we'll be able to take some questions, additional questions at that time, but we want to make sure we get to the keynote speaker. The lunch is directly across the hall. It is a sit-down lunch, and I'd like you to, if possible, make your way across the hall, and we'll set up for our keynote speaker there. The podium is there. Thank you.